The grand hall was decorated in a way that made every guest feel important. Soft golden lights hung from crystal chandeliers, and their gentle glow gave the entire room a warm and royal atmosphere. Expensive paintings covered the tall walls, and the marble floor reflected the light like water. Everything in the room showed wealth and power, and the people attending the event were used to being surrounded by luxury. The host of the evening, a rich businessman known for his big parties, wanted this night to be remembered. He believed that every successful person should show their status through celebrations, and tonight was his chance to impress everyone he admired or wanted to influence. He had invited politicians, artists, investors, and influential social figures. Everyone in the room wore clothes that looked like they were made for royalty. Men walked around in fitted suits and shiny shoes, while women wore long dresses with diamonds and pearls that sparkled every time they moved. A live band played soft classical music in the background, creating a calm and elegant mood. The sound of violins and piano mixed with the quiet conversations of guests who laughed and chatted as if life always came this easily. Waiters moved quickly between tables, carrying trays of wine glasses and beautifully decorated dishes. Everything had to be perfect because people like these noticed every detail. Emma, a young waitress, worked silently among the servers. She wore a simple black uniform that made her look almost invisible next to the expensive clothing of the guests. She didn't belong to this world, and she knew it. Her job was only temporary, something she needed to pay for her small apartment and basic expenses. But even though she blended into the background, she was observant. She watched people, listened to conversations, and learned things no one imagined a waitress would understand. Most guests didn't even look at her when she served them. Their eyes went past her as if she wasn't a person, just part of the service. Emma was used to this. She had worked at many events like this, and she knew that rich people expected waiters to be quiet and invisible. She kept her head down, smiled when needed, and moved gracefully between tables. She was careful not to spill wine or bump into anyone. In places like this, one small mistake could cost her job. Even though Emma appeared calm, inside she felt something different. She loved music, especially the piano. Every time she heard the band play, her heart beat faster. She could identify notes, chords, and mistakes without thinking. She remembered how it felt to play, how her fingers used to move across the keys, how the sound filled her chest with warmth. But music for now was only a memory. Life had forced her to give up what she loved. Meanwhile, the rich guests continued to enjoy the night. They discussed business deals, expensive holidays, and achievements that mattered only in their social circle. They complimented each other with polite smiles but secretly judged everything, from outfits to conversations. Some were here for fun, but many were here to build their reputation. Events like this were more about being seen than about celebrating anything real. The host moved from group to group, shaking hands, laughing loudly, showing off his confidence. He liked attention, and he made sure everyone remembered that he was the center of the night. He had spent weeks planning the event, choosing the best decorations, hiring top chefs, and booking talented musicians. Everything was designed to make him look powerful and cultured, but beneath all the glamour there was a strange emptiness. The guests looked perfect, but their smiles were practiced. Their laughter seemed too loud, too controlled. They were not relaxed. They were performing just like actors on a stage. Emma could see this clearly. She watched their faces, their gestures, and she could tell who was genuinely happy and who was pretending. She thought it was ironic, how people with everything could still look lost or insecure. As the evening continued, the music became more energetic, and the guests grew more comfortable after drinking expensive wine. Some danced, some flirted, and some talked louder than necessary. Emma kept working quietly, moving from one guest to another, carrying fresh glasses and taking away empty ones. She never complained, never rushed, never drew attention. What she didn't know was that this night, which seemed just like any other event she had worked at, would change her life completely. She had no idea that her forgotten talent would soon become the center of attention. She had no idea that the rich host, who didn't even know her name, would soon challenge her in front of everyone. And she had no idea that a single moment of courage would reveal a side of her that no one there expected. For now, she was just a waitress in a grand event full of wealthy strangers. But the night was only beginning, and destiny was slowly moving toward her, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. As the evening continued, the music slowed down and the crowd became more relaxed. People had found their favorite groups, and conversations started to sound more personal, though everything still had a touch of sophistication. The wealthy host moved confidently between circles of important guests, entertaining them with stories about his travels, achievements, and expensive hobbies. Every time he spoke, people listened, not because they admired him, but because they didn't want to risk offending someone with power. The host enjoyed being admired. He believed that success was something you had to show off, not something you kept quiet. He took pride in being known as a man who lived life better than everyone else. For him, luxury wasn't just comfort, it was proof of superiority. The grand event, the expensive decorations, the polished music, all existed to remind others of how high he stood above ordinary people. At one point, the band took a break and the music slowly faded into silence. Without the background sounds, the room suddenly felt too quiet. A few guests clapped politely, while others turned their attention to their drinks or conversations. The host used this moment to gather the attention of the nearest group. He began to speak about the importance of class and culture, using complicated words that made him sound knowledgeable. He talked about how not everyone could understand art, and how true talent came from people with refinement and good upbringing. His voice carried a tone of confidence that bordered on arrogance, as if he enjoyed listening to himself more than anything else. Some guests nodded, pretending to agree, while others simply smiled to avoid conflict. No one wanted to challenge him because he was known to be sensitive about his reputation. In his mind, being wealthy meant being right. Meanwhile, Emma stood a short distance away holding a tray of drinks. She wasn't interested in the conversation, but she heard enough to understand what he meant. She had listened to many powerful men talk like this, people who thought money made them better. She didn't take it personally, but deep down, it frustrated her. She believed that talent and intelligence could come from anywhere, from anyone, no matter how simple their life looked. The host continued, becoming more bold as he noticed the guests paying attention. He said something that made the crowd uncomfortable, yet no one dared to disagree. He claimed that ordinary people often believed they had talent, but it was rarely true. According to him, real talent came from people who had the time and money to explore it. Working-class people, he said, spend their lives surviving, not creating. A few people glanced awkwardly across the room, aware that servers were nearby. But he didn't care. He didn't see them as individuals. He saw them as background decorations, tools that existed to make his evening smoother. Emma didn't react. She held her tray steady and kept her expression calm, though inside she felt a small sting. She thought of all the musicians she had known who practiced in cheap apartments, playing on old instruments, pouring their hearts into music without applause or recognition. Some of them were brilliant, but life had pushed them down not because they lacked talent, but because they lacked opportunity. One of the other servers, a young man named Lucas, was standing close to her. He knew Emma well enough to understand that the host's words bothered her more than she showed. He leaned slightly closer and whispered, "Ignore him. He wouldn't recognize talent if it wasn't covered in gold." Emma smiled quietly, appreciating the support even if she didn't show it fully. But the conversation took a sudden turn when another guest, slightly drunk and overly curious, asked if any of the staff had talent worth showing. He said it as a joke, but the host took interest in the idea. He laughed loudly and made a sarcastic remark, saying that if any waiter could play the piano like the musicians, he would be genuinely impressed. Some guests laughed politely, not sure if they were supposed to. Others looked away, embarrassed for the servers who had to stand there and listen. Lucas made the mistake of glancing at Emma, and the host noticed. He raised his eyebrow and asked what that look meant. Lucas didn't want trouble, so he shook his head and shrugged. But someone nearby, a female guest who had overheard earlier conversations, said casually, "I think she plays piano." The room fell quiet. Emma froze for a second, her heart jumping unexpectedly. She didn't know the guest, and she didn't know why someone would reveal that. The host looked at Emma with new curiosity, though not with admiration, more like amusement. He smiled in a way that wasn't friendly. "A pianist?" he asked loudly. "How interesting. Tell me, is she good or does she simply think she is?" People turned to look at Emma, but she didn't move. She kept her eyes down, wishing the moment would pass. She didn't want attention. She didn't want to be judged by someone who believed talent was measured in money. The host leaned back, entertained by the idea of humiliating her. "Maybe," he said mockingly, "we should let our waitress perform. Then we'll see if ordinary people truly have hidden talent after all." A few guests chuckled nervously, some looked uncomfortable, others looked curious. Emma stood silently, her heart heavy and her mind racing. She didn't know it yet, but the challenge had already begun. The sudden silence in the room felt heavy, as if every sound had been swallowed by the walls. The guests, who only moments ago were laughing and drinking, now turned their attention to Emma, the quiet waitress who stood at the edge of the crowd. She held an empty tray against her chest, unsure what to do with her hands or her eyes. She wished she could disappear, sink through the floor, or blend into the curtains. But there was no escape. The wealthy host had spoken, and his voice had become the command of the evening. He leaned slightly forward, staring at her as if she were an object of curiosity, not a person. A confident smile stretched across his face, the kind people use when they are certain they are in control. "Well," he asked loudly, making sure everyone could hear, "do you play, or is this just a story someone made up?" The words didn't feel like a question, they felt like a trap. Emma could tell that he wasn't interested in discovering talent, he wanted entertainment, and humiliation was his preferred style. A few guests looked at her with interest, waiting to see if she would defend herself. Others stared with sympathy, silently hoping she would refuse and avoid embarrassment. But no one spoke on her behalf. No one told the host to stop. In rooms like this, courage was rare and silence was safer. Emma took a slow breath and looked down, avoiding his eyes. She didn't want to lie, she did play. She had spent years studying music, practicing for hours until her fingers ached. She had dreamed of performing in front of large audiences, not rich strangers, but people who loved music as much as she did. But life had changed, and those dreams had been buried. She didn't want to show her talent here, not in a place where it would be judged like a party trick. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could answer, the host clapped his hands loudly to gather more attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced with exaggerated excitement, "we have a musician hiding among the staff." Some guests laughed, others clapped softly, more out of politeness than enthusiasm. Emma felt her cheeks burn. She swallowed hard, trying not to show her discomfort. Lucas, the other waiter, stepped closer to her. He whispered so only she could hear, "You don't have to do it, just say no." His voice was calm but worried. He knew the host could make things difficult for anyone who embarrassed him. Emma gave a small nod, appreciating the support. She opened her mouth to refuse, but then the host raised a hand dramatically and spoke again. "To make things interesting," he said, "if she plays well, I will donate a large sum of money to charity." He paused a moment, allowing people to react. "But if she plays badly, well, at least we will have a good laugh." The room reacted with mixed emotions, some impressed by the promise of charity, others uncomfortable with the cruelty of the second part. Emma's stomach tightened. She could feel everyone waiting for her answer. The host stepped closer, lowering his voice as if offering a private challenge, though still loud enough for others to hear. "Come now, don't be shy, show us what makes you special." His tone sounded like encouragement, but there was something sharp beneath it, something manipulative. Emma didn't want attention, she didn't want to be watched or judged, but a tiny part of her deep inside felt something else, anger, pride, maybe both. Who was this man to decide who was talented and who was? Who was he to turn someone's passion into a test for entertainment? She looked at the piano on the stage. The polished black surface reflected the lights like a mirror. The keys, white and clean, waited silently, innocent and untouched. For a moment, a memory flashed in her mind. The smell of old sheet music, the sound of applause from her school recitals, her teacher's proud smile, the joy of creating music without fear. But that was before her life had become a constant struggle. Emma exhaled slowly and finally spoke. Her voice was soft but clear. "I haven't played in a long time," she said, trying to keep things neutral. "I don't think this is a good idea." The host raised an eyebrow, pretending to be surprised. "Too afraid to try?" he asked loudly. The question wasn't curiosity, it was provocation. He wanted her to react. He wanted to control her choice by making refusal look like weakness. Some guests frowned, uncomfortable with his tone. A few others leaned in closer, eager to see drama. Emma felt the pressure growing heavier, as if the entire room demanded an answer. For a moment, she considered walking away. She didn't need to prove anything to these people. Her worth did not depend on their approval. But then she imagined the host laughing at her retreat. She imagined the guests whispering about how she claimed to have talent but was too scared to show it. She imagined her dignity slowly shrinking under their judgment. And suddenly she didn't want to run. She looked up directly at the host for the first time. Her eyes were calm even if her heart was. "If I play," she said quietly, "I don't want your donation to charity to be a joke." The host blinked, momentarily thrown off by her composed response. The room murmured, surprised that she spoke back. Emma continued, her words steady. "If I play, and if I play well, you donate seriously, not for fun, for real." The host smiled again, but this time it was tighter, less confident. She had shifted the tone. She had taken the challenge and reshaped it. He extended his hand dramatically. "Agreement," he said. "Play for us and make it worth listening to." The room waited, breathless. Emma walked toward the piano slowly, cautiously, but with a quiet resolve that made people step aside for her. She still didn't know if she would succeed. But she knew one thing clearly. She refused to be humiliated. Emma's footsteps made almost no sound on the shiny floor, but inside her chest, her heart was beating so loudly she felt as if everyone could hear it. The distance between her and the piano was short, but it felt like a long road that she had to cross. One filled with invisible eyes, silent judgment, and rising fear. She had walked this hall many times before with trays of glasses, but this time it felt different. She was no longer a servant moving quietly. All eyes were on her, waiting to see what she would do. The guests stepped aside, forming a loose path. Some looked excited as if they were about to watch a performance. Others looked worried for her, knowing how cruel public attention could be, but no one reached out to comfort her. Rich people rarely risked looking foolish by showing kindness to someone beneath them. The piano sat at the edge of the stage, shining under bright lights. It looked proud and intimidating, like a giant waiting to test her. Its polished surface reflected her nervous face, reminding her that she was no longer invisible. Emma felt her palms sweating, so she rubbed them quickly against her uniform, trying to steady herself. The room was so quiet that she could hear whispers echoing behind her. A few guests whispered bets about whether she would play well or embarrass herself. Some joked about giving her a drink beforehand. Others debated if she had ever played anything more complicated than children's songs. Emma didn't turn around, but she could feel their words on her back like tiny needles. Lucas stood frozen near the serving station, his eyes full of worry. He knew Emma was talented, but he also knew how frightening it was to perform in such a room, where people cared less about music and more about entertainment. He wished he could stop her, save her from the pressure, but he understood why she accepted the challenge. Sometimes dignity mattered more than safety. Meanwhile, the host leaned against a pillar, watching her like a director watching his actor walk onto a stage. His expression was not warm, it was calculating. He didn't expect her to surprise him. He expected her to crush herself with fear. He didn't believe that someone like her could control an audience. Only wealthy people were allowed that power. Emma reached the piano and paused. She placed one hand on the wooden surface and closed her eyes for a second. She wasn't praying. She was remembering. She thought of her childhood, her small second-hand piano, the one with chipped keys that her mother bought for cheap because she believed her daughter had something special. She remembered practicing late into the night, copying songs by ear because she couldn't afford lessons at first. She remembered her teacher later telling her she had a rare gift, an emotional ear. But dreams didn't survive in a world where bills needed paying. She had stopped playing because life demanded work, not art. The piano became a luxury she could no longer afford. She opened her eyes and pulled the bench back slightly. She sat down slowly, afraid that her shaking legs would give her away. The bench felt too cold, too stiff. She placed her hands on her lap and stared at the keys, white and black, waiting patiently. They looked harmless yet powerful, capable of both beauty and disaster. The problem wasn't that she couldn't play. The problem was whether she could control her fear. She took a deep breath. The air felt heavy, almost sticky. Her mind was loud with doubt. What if I make a mistake? What if my hands shake too much? What if I freeze? What if they laugh? But another thought, quieter yet stronger, rose beneath the fear. What if I don't try? What if I walk away and regret it forever? She lifted her hands and stretched her fingers slowly, remembering how they used to move easily, like water flowing across a river. She wished she had time to warm up, to test the keys, to find confidence, but she didn't. She had one chance, one moment, one performance to either prove herself or disappear. She glanced toward the audience and noticed something surprising. Not everyone looked cruel or judgmental. Some looked curious, some even supportive, as if they hoped she would succeed. A few guests who loved music recognized the tension in her posture. They knew that only someone who cared deeply about music could look so afraid and so determined at the same time. The host finally spoke, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Whenever you're ready," he said, pretending to sound generous, but the tone of his voice carried amusement, as if he expected failure. Emma didn't respond. She didn't even look at him. She lowered her head, took another slow breath, and lifted her hands toward the keys. Her fingers hovered above them, trembling. She had not played in months, maybe even a year. She didn't know if her hands remembered what her heart never forgot. At that moment, a small memory surfaced, her mother's voice saying, "Music isn't about perfection, it's about emotion. Play what you feel and people will listen." Emma didn't know if she could impress these people, but she could play for herself. She could play because she loved it. The first note had not been played yet, but something had already changed inside her. She wasn't walking to her humiliation, she was walking back to herself. She placed her fingers gently on the keys, and the room held its breath. Emma's fingers rested on the keys, but for a few seconds she didn't play anything. It wasn't because she didn't know what to play. It was because she needed to find courage inside herself, the same courage she used to have when she believed in her dreams. The silence in the room felt heavier than any sound she could make. Everyone waited, their eyes fixed on her, expecting either brilliance or disaster. She inhaled slowly, filling her lungs with air, as if that could calm her shaking hands. Her heart pounded so strongly that she could feel it in her fingertips. She looked down at the piano, not at the crowd. This was safer. This was familiar. She whispered to herself inside her mind, just one note, start with one note. Finally, she pressed a single key. It was soft, gentle, almost shy. The sound floated into the room like a secret. Some guests leaned forward, surprised at how quiet the first note was. They expected something dramatic, loud, confident, something bold, but Emma didn't choose force. She chose emotion. The first note was followed by another and then another. Slowly, carefully, she began to play a melody she hadn't touched in years. It wasn't complicated or flashy. It wasn't meant to impress. It was heartfelt, nostalgic, pure. With each note, her fear loosened just a little. Her hands remembered more than she expected. The music flowed not from memory, but from a part of her that had never died. In the audience, a few music lovers recognized the song. It wasn't famous, but it had beauty, sadness, and warmth in its composition. They exchanged impressed glances, realizing she wasn't playing random notes. She was performing something meaningful. The room remained silent. No one coughed, whispered, or laughed, not because they respected her, but because they were confused. They didn't know how to react to something so tender. They were used to loud applause, bold gestures, power. But Emma was offering vulnerability, and people didn't know what to do with vulnerability. Her hands were still trembling, but the trembling started to blend into the music, making it sound more human. Her fingers slipped once, barely noticeable, but she didn't stop or freeze. She continued, letting the mistake disappear into the melody. She realized something important in that moment. Perfection wasn't necessary. Authenticity was. As she played, something shifted in the atmosphere. Guests who originally watched her with judgment now watched her with curiosity. Guests who expected a joke now listened seriously. Some even felt a strange emotion rise in their chests, something they didn't expect to feel at a fancy party. Music didn't care about money or status. It moved people whether they wanted it or not. Emma's face relaxed, her shoulders lowered, and her breathing slowed. The fear didn't disappear completely, but it changed shape. It became energy. It became passion. She wasn't playing to survive or to win approval. She was playing because, for the first time in too long, she wanted to. The wealthy host standing at the back watched her with narrowed eyes. His confident smile had faded. He wasn't entertained, he was surprised. He hadn't expected her to actually play well, not with expression, not with depth. He thought she would hit a few wrong notes, blush, and walk away embarrassed. But she was doing something else entirely. Her music wasn't loud or showy, but it had something real, an honesty that couldn't be bought. And that scared him more than any mistake she could have made. Other guests began to feel embarrassed, not for Emma, but for themselves. They remembered how quickly they had judged her, how they assumed she had nothing to offer. Watching her play made them realize how small-minded they had been. Some of them lowered their eyes, ashamed. Emma continued, lost in her own world. She wasn't thinking about the audience or the host or the challenge. She wasn't thinking about humiliation or victory. She was thinking about the music, the sound, the feeling. The piano became her voice, saying all the things she never had the courage to say aloud. As she reached the middle of the piece, the melody grew stronger, more emotional. It had sadness, but also hope. It sounded like a story, one of loss, struggle, and quiet strength. A few guests, without realizing it, began to hold their breath. One elderly woman wiped a tear from her eye, surprised at herself. She hadn't cried from music in years. Emma didn't see any of this. She was focused, fully absorbed. Her fingers moved with confidence now, faster, more fluid. She didn't force control. She surrendered to the rhythm, letting instinct guide her. The fear that controlled her walk to the piano was gone. In its place was freedom. When she reached the final line of the piece, she slowed down, making the ending soft, delicate, fragile. Each note faded like a whisper, disappearing into silence. The last note wasn't loud. It wasn't meant to be. It was the kind of ending that made people pause before reacting, because reacting too quickly would ruin the moment. Emma lifted her hands off the keys and placed them in her lap. She exhaled, shaky but relieved. For 1 second, the room was completely silent. Then, unexpectedly, someone began to clap. A small sound, soft, respectful. Others joined, first unsure, then certain. The applause grew into something real, not polite or forced. Emma didn't look proud. She didn't smile big. She just looked thankful that she remembered who she was, even if just for a few minutes. The wealthy host clapped last, slowly, quietly, without a smile. The host clapped last, slowly, quietly, without a smile. Because he knew more than anyone else in that room, he hadn't expected to be moved. For several seconds after Emma finished playing, the applause felt uncertain, almost shy. People weren't sure if they should clap loudly or quietly, or if they should stand up or simply nod. It wasn't because they didn't like the performance. It was because they weren't prepared for how emotional it had been. The room, which earlier buzzed with laughter and confident voices, now held a different kind of energy, soft, thoughtful, almost fragile. Emma sat still for a moment, her hands resting on her lap, afraid to look at anyone. She didn't want to see doubt or mockery in their faces. She was too vulnerable, too exposed. She lowered her eyes as if looking up would break her balance. But when she finally raised her head, she didn't see laughter. She didn't see boredom. She saw faces that looked changed, faces that had been touched by something genuine. Some guests clapped with gentle respect, others with surprise. A few, who earlier seemed uninterested in anything but gossip, now clapped with enthusiasm. The music had reached them in a place their money couldn't touch. The applause grew louder, building slowly until it filled the hall. Not everyone clapped, of course. Some people clapped only because they felt they should, not because they cared. But many clapped sincerely. For a moment, Emma didn't feel like a waitress serving drinks. She felt like a musician again. Among the crowd, a middle-aged woman dabbed her eyes with a tissue, embarrassed by her tears. She had come to the event expecting food, wine, and shallow conversation. Not a performance that stirred old memories of her youth, of dreams she once had, of music she once loved. Emma had reminded her of a version of herself she had forgotten. Nearby, a serious-looking man in a dark suit leaned over to his companion and whispered, "She has real talent." His tone carried surprise, as if he couldn't believe that someone who served drinks could also touch people with music. His companion nodded silently, still keeping her eyes on Emma with a softness that wasn't there earlier. Lucas, who had watched the entire performance from afar, smiled with relief. His smile wasn't wide or showy. It was the kind of smile someone gives when something heavy in their heart finally lifts. He clapped louder than most guests, proud not because she had impressed rich people but because she had stood up for herself. But not everyone reacted with kindness. A few guests sat with stiff expressions, refusing to clap. They didn't like being proven wrong. They didn't like the idea that someone without wealth could have something impressive to offer. It challenged their belief that status and talent came from the same place. To them, Emma's performance had disrupted a comfortable lie. At the back of the room, the wealthy host clapped slowly, not with enthusiasm but with thoughtfulness. His expression was difficult to read. His usual arrogance was replaced with something else, analyzing, calculating. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't angry. He looked like a man who had witnessed something unexpected, and now he needed to rethink his earlier assumptions. He glanced at a few guests nearby who seemed genuinely moved by the performance. He didn't like the feeling of losing control over the evening's attention. It annoyed him that a waitress, someone he had challenged as a joke, now held the audience's admiration. He couldn't ignore what happened, but he didn't want to celebrate it either. Emma finally stood up from the piano bench, her legs shaky. She didn't bow dramatically or smile widely. She simply nodded slightly, a soft and humble gesture. She wasn't used to applause, she wasn't used to being seen, and the attention, even positive, felt overwhelming. As she began to walk away, something surprising happened. People moved aside respectfully, giving her space, as if she were someone important, not someone hired to serve them. They looked at her with curiosity, admiration, and even guilt. They were seeing her for the first time. One woman reached out and touched Emma's arm gently. "That was beautiful," she said softly with genuine emotion. Emma smiled, small but sincere. "Thank you," she replied, her voice quiet. Another guest, a young man who looked like a musician himself, leaned forward and whispered, "You should be performing on a stage, not serving drinks." He spoke it like an obvious truth, not a compliment. Emma didn't know how to respond, so she simply nodded and walked on. She wanted to return to the comfort of her work, to the safety of routine. But with every step, she realized something strange. She no longer felt like the same person who had walked to the piano. She felt lighter, freer, more confident. She had faced her fear and won not by impressing others, but by being true to herself. The applause began to fade, replaced by hushed conversations. Guests leaned close to each other, dissecting what they had just seen. "Where did she train?" someone asked. "Why is she working here?" another questioned. A few guests debated whether she could have a future in music. For the first time in years, Emma's talent wasn't invisible. It was being discussed, valued, admired. But the wealthy host wasn't ready to let the moment end. He stepped forward, raising his hand politely to stop the remaining applause. The room quieted immediately. He cleared his throat, ready to speak, but he paused, as if struggling to find the right words. He looked at Emma with an expression that wasn't cold but wasn't friendly either. It was complex, conflicted. "That was unexpected," he said. Some guests frowned, sensing the dismissive tone in his voice. Others leaned closer, excited for more drama. Emma didn't answer, she just watched him, waiting. The host continued, "I promised a donation. And I will keep my words." A murmur spread through the room. Some were impressed by his honesty, others unimpressed by his lack of grace. "But don't think this means I was wrong," he added quickly, insecurely. "Talent is rare, very rare. And it doesn't change a person's place in life." The compliment had turned into a reminder of status, a gentle push back into her box. But Emma didn't shrink, she didn't argue either. She simply replied calmly, "Talent doesn't change who I am, it just shows who I could have been." The room went quiet again. People looked at her with new respect. For the first time in a very long time, Emma realized something important. She had nothing left to prove to anyone. After Emma stepped away from the piano and the wealthy host finished speaking, the evening slowly started again. The noise of conversation rose, music resumed, and the scent of expensive wine filled the air. But something in the room felt different, as if the air had changed shape. People were moving, talking, drinking like before, yet the mood had a quiet thoughtfulness that hadn't existed earlier. Guests who were once confident and loud now seemed a little unsure of themselves. Some laughed too loudly, trying to return to the atmosphere of luxury and ease. Others spoke softly, still thinking about the performance they had just heard. A few guests avoided Emma completely, not because they disliked her, but because they didn't know how to talk to someone who had just changed their perspective in a few minutes. Emma, dressed again in her simple uniform, returned to her job carrying trays and clearing glasses, but she didn't move with the same invisible presence she had before. People noticed her now. They saw her when she passed. They didn't look through her, they looked at her. It made her feel exposed, but it also made her feel strangely powerful. Lucas rushed over as soon as he found a moment free from work. His face lit up when he saw her. "You were incredible," he whispered, careful not to speak too loudly. Emma smiled nervously, still unsure how to accept praise. "I just did what I could," she replied, but Lucas shook his head. "No. You did something most people would never have the courage to do." Emma looked away, embarrassed. She didn't feel brave. She felt shaky, fragile, and exhausted. Performing in front of strangers was difficult, but performing in front of people who expected her to fail was terrifying. She wasn't proud of herself yet. She was still trying to process what she had done. When she went to serve drinks, several guests stopped her to say something kind. One woman told her she reminded her of her daughter. Another man asked if she taught piano. A younger girl shyly asked if Emma believed people without money could still achieve their dreams. Emma didn't know how to answer that. She didn't want to lie, and she didn't want to crush a dream. So she said, "Dreams are possible, but life doesn't make it easy." The girl nodded as if she already knew. Not everyone reacted with kindness. A group of wealthy men near the bar joked quietly, annoyed that a server had become the center of attention. They weren't cruel in front of her, but she could feel their irritation in the way they looked at her. In their world, power was everything, and tonight, power had shifted in a way they didn't like. The wealthy host, meanwhile, stayed distant. He didn't approach her again. He spoke to other guests, but not with his usual confidence. He was quieter, slower in speech, almost reflective. Watching her performance had shaken him, not because it proved her talent, but because it reminded him that he didn't control everything. For a man addicted to control, that was uncomfortable. Emma didn't want to interact with him again, but a part of her wished he would say something sincere, even small, something that showed he respected her now. But he stayed silent, and silence was its own message. Later, Emma had a short break. She stepped outside onto a balcony where the city lights glowed in the distance. The night air was cold but refreshing. She leaned against the railing, letting the wind cool her face. She finally let herself breathe fully without worrying about who was watching. It surprised her how emotional she felt. Not proud, exactly, more relieved. She hadn't played perfectly, she hadn't been confident, but she had faced something frightening and didn't run away. That meant something. She remembered the first note she played, the way her fingers shook, the way her heart almost stopped. She remembered the applause, the faces in the audience, the woman who cried, the man who whispered she had real talent. All of it replayed in her mind like a dream. She had forgotten what it felt like to be seen not as a worker or a servant, but as a person with ability, with depth, with passion. Behind her, the door opened softly. Someone stepped onto the balcony, but Emma didn't turn around immediately. She didn't want to break the quiet. It was the middle-aged woman who had cried earlier. She approached slowly, her heels tapping against the floor. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," she said gently. Emma shook her head. "No, you're not." The woman stood beside her, looking at the city lights. "Your performance brought back memories for me," she admitted, her voice full of old sadness. "I used to play too, not as beautifully as you, but I loved it." Emma listened quietly. "I stopped," the woman continued. "Life got busy, responsibilities grew. I always thought I would return to it later, but later never came." Emma nodded. She understood that story too well. "Don't lose yours," the woman said softly. "Don't let the world take it from you." Emma felt something warm in her chest, but also something painful. She didn't know if she could follow that advice. She didn't know if she had the luxury to chase her passion again. "I don't know if I can," she whispered. The woman looked at her with kind, tired eyes. "Maybe you can't right now, but don't bury it forever." Emma didn't answer. She stared at the city, wondering what her life could have been if things had been different. After a moment, the woman went back inside, leaving Emma alone again. Emma took one deep breath, then two, then three. The cold air cleared her thoughts. She wasn't rich, she wasn't powerful, she wasn't suddenly successful. But something inside her had changed. She didn't want to be invisible anymore. And somewhere inside her heart, a voice she had long forgotten whispered, "Maybe it's not too late." When the event finally came to an end, guests began leaving slowly, as if their expensive shoes were suddenly heavier than before. The laughter that filled the hall earlier sounded weaker now, forced, almost like everyone was pretending they were okay with a night that hadn't gone according to their expectations. People smiled politely, hugged, and exchanged fake promises of meeting again soon. But their minds were still inside the ballroom, holding onto the performance they had witnessed. Emma continued working, collecting glasses, clearing tables, folding napkins. Her uniform was stained with drops of wine, her hair messy from moving all night long, but for the first time she didn't feel small. She didn't feel like a shadow, she felt like a human being, flawed, tired, but alive. Several staff members approached her quietly, each offering simple compliments that meant more than any applause. "You were amazing," one said. "I didn't know you could do that." Another added, "I always thought you had something different about you." Emma smiled, thanking them with genuine warmth. She didn't want admiration from the wealthy guests. She wanted understanding from people who knew struggle. The wealthy host watched all of this from a distance. He stood with a glass of wine in his hand, but he barely drank it. His proud posture had changed. He slouched slightly, like someone who had been forced to think about uncomfortable truths. He didn't approach Emma again. Maybe he was too embarrassed. Maybe he didn't know what to say. Or maybe, deep down, he knew that anything he said would sound insincere. Some part of him probably wished the performance had been bad. It would have protected his ego and kept his worldview intact. But talent had appeared in the most inconvenient place, shaking his confidence. Money could buy many things, but it couldn't buy authenticity. And he had witnessed authenticity tonight, whether he liked it or not. Emma didn't think about him anymore. She had freed herself from that moment the second she finished playing. Now she just wanted to go home, take off her uncomfortable shoes, and lie in bed. But before leaving, she took one last look at the grand piano. Its keys were silent now, waiting for another musician, another story, another heart to touch. She wondered when, or if, she would ever get to sit in front of one again. Lucas walked over, his eyes brimming with pride. "You should be happy," he said softly. "That was a victory." Emma chuckled weakly. It didn't feel like a victory, it just felt scary. "That's what bravery feels like," he responded. They walked together to the staff room where they changed out of their uniforms. Emma packed her worn-out shoes and folded her apron carefully. She felt exhausted, not just physically but emotionally. Yet beneath the exhaustion was a quiet sense of satisfaction, like a small flame glowing in the dark. Outside, the night was cold, but the sky was clear. Streetlights flickered, cars passed, and the city carried on, unaware of the small shift that had happened in one woman's life. Emma stood for a moment before leaving, looking up at the stars. She remembered playing piano under the window when she was younger, before life became complicated, before adulthood arrived with bills and heartbreak and loneliness. She whispered to herself, maybe I could start again, not big, just small. She didn't imagine fame or fortune. She didn't dream of standing on massive stages or signing autographs. She simply wanted to return to the thing that once made her feel whole. Music had reminded her who she was beneath the uniform, beneath the exhaustion, beneath the fear. As she walked home, she passed by a music shop she used to visit years ago. The window lights were off, but she could see the outline of instruments through the glass, guitars, violins, and a tiny keyboard on display. She stopped and stared, not because she wanted to buy anything, but because it reminded her of possibility. She wondered if she could save money to buy a cheap keyboard, one she could use to practice late at night. Not because she wanted applause, but because playing made her feel like she existed in a world beyond survival. Maybe she could teach herself again, slowly, patiently. Maybe she could rebuild the dream she abandoned, not for others but for herself. The walk home was long, but she didn't rush. The cold air felt fresh on her skin and her mind was quiet, peaceful. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't thinking about failure. She was thinking about hope. When she reached her apartment, she lit a small lamp and sat on the floor, her back against the wall. The room was simple, barely furnished, but it felt safe. She took off her shoes, stretched her sore feet, and let out a tired laugh. She whispered to the empty room, I did it. Not perfectly, not confidently, but honestly. She closed her eyes and imagined playing again, not at fancy events with judgmental strangers, but for herself, alone, happy. She imagined her fingers remembering old songs, finding new ones, creating sounds that healed the parts of her she had neglected. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. The event would become a memory, the applause would fade, and the world would move on. But something inside her had changed forever. She had discovered courage she forgot she had, talent she thought she lost, and a voice she almost buried. And as she drifted to sleep, she realized that sometimes the biggest changes don't happen in loud moments of victory. Sometimes they happen quietly, in the private, silent decision to begin again. Emma didn't need anyone's permission anymore. She just needed a piano. She just needed a piano.